So welcome everyone. Lovely to see you all here. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher, and the other one is Sebastian. You can see us both here under the name Qesher. Lovely to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces as well. So I'll just say a couple of words about us and what we do. So we started this initiative 4.5 years ago, just in the beginning of COVID. And our aim was and has been to bring you through this Zoom presentation, a bit of history and culture, and also the present day situation from Jewish communities from all over the world. So we've been learning together about Jewish communities from every continent, from different cities, countries. And today, as you all know, we're going to learn about the Jewish communities of Zimbabwe and Zambia today. We are very happy to welcome David Bloom, who is our speaker. He was born in Zimbabwe and then later moved to Israel, and this is where he lives now, but he also worked in Zimbabwe, and he's done an extensive documentation about the history and the heritage, and he has an amazing website that we will, of course, share with everybody after the talk. So if you're interested in learning even more than what you will learn today, then we really recommend to visit his website. So now I'm just going to pass the word to David. If there are any questions, then please put them in the chat. And after his presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. So David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dora. So it's really great to see some familiar faces on the screen. And I want to thank them. I want to thank Sebastian and Dora for inviting me here to present to this audience. So my challenge this evening will be that there'll be some people who are very familiar with the story, and there'll be some people who know nothing. And I have to find a balance between the two. So I hope you'll bear with me, and I hope you'll learn new things, and I hope it'll be interesting. But that's the challenge I have in presenting the story. I'm going to kick off by putting on my slideshow. Just going to fix up here this few things that are on the screen, get them off the screen. All right, so that you should be okay on that. Dora, we're okay?
Yes.
Okay. So these are basically the communities of Zimbabwe, the Jewish communities of Zimbabwe and Zambia. I call them modern shtetls because we are talking about relatively modern times. We're talking about the 1890s through to today. Not a very long period in Jewish history, but in my view, an interesting one. I'm just briefly about myself. Well, let me just tell you what you'll learn today. You'll get a geographic and historical timeline of the two countries, about the early immigration, which really, the first signs were actually in the 1860s, but bulk of it was started in the 1890s through to the 1930s. You'll learn about the culture and the lifestyles of the communities through to the 70s. The impact of independence for both countries. They were originally Southern Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia, and they became Zambia and Zimbabwe. We'll talk about that. And of course, I'll talk about what's happening today and a bit, maybe, briefly about the future. So just before let me just go back 1 minute. Before I start, I'm just briefly about myself. So I was born in Zimbabwe, educated there, and I left I was born in 1953, left in 1973, and I came to Israel. I grew up very much, going to school in what was Rhodesia, very British style education with uniforms and very much the kind of discipline and the style of those, the 50s and 60s of Britain. We had wonderful teachers most of them from Scotland and from England. And I came here mainly because, well, a lot of it to do with the fact that I was involved in Habonim youth movement, the Zionist youth movement. And from a very young age, I thought, and I really wanted to make my life here in Israel. That's briefly about me. I went back in 1989. I worked for Reuters, and I was with Reuters. I joined Reuters here in Israel, and they posted me after having lived in Israel for nearly 20 years. They actually posted me to Zimbabwe, to Harare, which was an amazing experience for myself and my family. We lived there for nearly 5 years. And I really re-engaged with the story, and the community had dwindled enormously. So when we left in 1994 and went to London for a few years, I was with Reuters headquarters in London. You know, I think the one thing that left was strong kind of, it impacted me on the fact that the story was going to be lost unless someone actually started collecting stories. And I had the fortune of those of you who remember Eliza Hatchwell, Marvin Hatchwell, and a few others who had started collecting stories of families, and they were able to share those with me. And I started a website about 20 years ago. I'll go into that later. Okay, so that's what you'll learn today, and I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is basically the start of the story of this area of the world. These are the main centers that I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk briefly about how the Jews arrived in this part of the world, very much in the 1870s, 1880s. Jews had been in South Africa for 100 years before that, but there were Jews leaving the pogroms of Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Latvia, the Pale settlement, and they were finding new places to basically be secure and maybe make a better life. And of course, South Africa was an option. A lot of Lithuanians came out to South Africa. It's a whole different story. But they arrived in Cape Town or in Durban, and they basically were drawn to the stories of gold that was being discovered, diamonds in Kimberley, and the gold reef of Johannesburg, around Johannesburg, the opportunities that were opening for people who were willing to take the risk and travel up there. And excuse me, the South African the situation in South Africa was that the area around Johannesburg in those years was actually an Afrikaner kind of republic. It was independent from the British Cape Colony. And there were two Boer Wars. So those of you who know a bit about the Boer Wars, the first Boer War was in 1880. And it was primarily a struggle between the British Empire and the Boer settlers, the Afrikaners, who were in the Transvaal area, the area around Johannesburg. The second Boer War was around 1899 and lasted till 1902. So in the background of all this immigration, there were a lot of political problems in South Africa, and I'll talk about the fact that a lot of the infrastructure was impacted during those years. My own father, well, sorry, on my dad's side, my grandfather Philip Bloom actually grew up in England in a town called Grimsby. His parents had come from Poland in the 1880s to England. He grew up in Grimsby, and as a young man, he decided to seek his fortune in South Africa. He reached Pretoria, where you can see on the map here, just a bit north of Johannesburg, and he met my grandmother, who had come with her family from Lithuania. They were a Luri family, and they had made their way to Pretoria. And my grandparents married in Pretoria, and as a young couple, they moved up to Salisbury to seek their fortunes in what was the beginning of Rhodesia. I'll talk about that as well. There were, of course, other immigrants who made their way via Beira. Beira is a port on the east coast of what is today Mozambique, and some immigrants, particularly from Rhodes, in the early 1900s, made their way down the east coast to Beira, and then made their way across to Salisbury from Beira. Not a big number, but some did come via Beira. Of course, Bulawayo was a big also, and I'll talk about the development of Bulawayo. Became a big railway junction, but I'll talk about that shortly. And then, of course, people started making their way even further via Victoria Falls and Livingston, and eventually to Lusaka, which was built a bit later, and to the Copper Belt. The Copper Belt was supposed to be the next sort of sorry, it's jumping. I don't know why it's jumping by itself. The Copper Belt was a opportunity. There was a lot of the people had been the black people had been mining there for many years, and there were expected to be opportunities in that area, and some Jews who were not actually involved in mining, but who saw business opportunities in the area of the Copper Belt. I'll talk about that when we get to Zambia later on in the presentation. So that's the general picture of how and the sort of movement of people in that area. Matabeleland was really the most southeastern area of what was Rhodesia, what would become Rhodesia. It was named after a tribe that existed in that area. That tribe was governed by a guy called Lobengula. He was he was a son of King Mzilikazi of the Ndebele tribe. They were an offshoot of the Zulus from South Africa, the Southern Africa, and they broke away. There'd been a lot of strife between the different tribes there. Ethnic chaos existed, and they had moved up to settle in this part of what is now Rhodesia, or the southeastern part of Rhodesia. The first known Jew to arrive in this area is a young Englishman called Daniel Montague Qesher. He arrived in about 1868. He was an explorer. He was in his early 20s, and he had he was mining and looking for gold and diamonds around what is called the Tati concession, which is on the border of what is now Botswana and Rhodesia. There's another colorful guy by the name of Paddy Cohen, an Irish guy, and he managed to negotiate mining concessions from Lobengula already in the 1870s, the early 1870s. And he was quite a wheeler dealer, quite a colorful guy, but he managed to develop quite a strong relationship with Lobengula. However, Cecil Rhodes, and I'll talk about him shortly, sent a delegation to Lobengula in 1888, and they basically negotiated a deal with Lobengula to obtain concessions for mining and for in the adjoining territories of Matabeleland. There was all sort of subterfuge about the way they went about this, getting this agreement from Lobengula, whether Lobengula actually understood what he was signing. But and Paddy Cohen challenged the Rudd concession people, and he actually tried to persuade Lobengula that he had been ripped off. It's a long story, but he lost out. Paddy Cohen was a single guy trying to fight a large corporate, and I'll talk about the corporate shortly, who had managed to obtain this Rudd concession. So you've got two Jewish pioneers here really in the early days before what is considered to be the first pioneer column, which arrived in 1890 to what is Mashonaland. Mashonaland is the area, if you can see my mouse, it's a bit further north here, in this area around here, northeast of Matabeleland. And there they raised the flag, the British flag, at a place which became Fort Salisbury. There were some Jews in that column. There are a couple of names. There was a Mosenthal, there was a Solomon, there was a Kronstein, and there was a Numier. They were some of the first Jews who arrived with that pioneer column to Mashonaland in 1890. So I mentioned Rhodes, and of course he was, very much involved in developing the area. And obviously the country eventually, Rhodesia, was named after Rhodes. But he had a partner by the name of Alfred Beit, who was basically his financier. Beit was a German Jew who had also been very successful in the diamond fields of Kimberley. He had joined up with Rhodes, and they became partners. And there was a third gentleman by the name of Barney Barnett Isaacs, another Jewish guy, who as well had become very wealthy on the diamond fields and then eventually on the gold fields. And he formed a partnership with Beit and with Rhodes, which eventually formed a company called De Beers. De Beers basically became the world. They controlled basically the world, the marketing and sale of diamonds around the world, and they became a hugely powerful force in the whole management and sale of diamonds. There's a famous saying from Cecil Rhodes that this country, he talked about Rhodesia in developing Rhodesia, and he said that this country is good if the Jews come. He was very impressed with Jewish, obviously, entrepreneurship, and worked closely with Beit and with Bonato. They formed the British South Africa Company. It was chartered by Cecil Rhodes in 1889, and it was modeled on the British East India Company. The British East India Company had been set up to, obviously, to develop all the spice trade in India, and he then modeled it and built up the British South Africa Company he was based in Cape Town, and they set up this company with some serious capital, and its mission was to develop mineral opportunities, especially in Mashonaland, in what was become Rhodesia. There was this kind of fantasy or this kind of belief that if there was this reef, if they had found gold on the Johannesburg, the reef around Johannesburg, there was every reason to believe that they would find gold further north. That's why they set up the British South Africa Company. And then the other plan which Rhodes had, he was really quite a visionary. He wanted to build a transport route from Cape Town through to Cairo, the Cape to Cairo transport route. And he had this, you can see this image that was published in the paper in those days. And you can see from this map, the sort of reddish areas around South Africa, Southern Africa, northern, southern Rhodesia, Tanganyika, going up through what was supposedly going to be controlled by Britain, was the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and also through Egypt. And he wanted to, and I'll show you the actual, this whole effort became known as the Scramble for Africa. All these countries like Portugal and England and even the Germans who were trying to grab these territories, it became known as the Scramble for Africa. The Belgians were involved, the Spanish. There were many countries in Europe trying to grab territories in Africa. Just to give you an idea of the early days of Bulawayo, this looks like a stagecoach that could be anywhere in the West United States. The famous cowboy pictures of stagecoaches. But this was actually a Bulawayo coach and mail service, which was running, that was running between Bulawayo and Johannesburg. and already from the 1890s that there was these transport facilities. This thing is jumping around so much. I'm sorry. So these rail networks were basically Rhodes' solution when I talked about the Cape to Cairo plan was based on rail networks. And if you look at the rail network in this picture in the middle, you can get an idea of where he had in mind the railway would run. It would run up through Kimberley, Bulawayo, Broken Hill in the Copperbelt, up past East Africa, Tanganyika, and up through Sudan into Egypt. What was actually built, if you can see on the left here, was a route from Cape Town to Bulawayo via Livingstone, of course to Salisbury and to Beira, but going further north to Broken Hill and into the Belgian Congo. That was what was actually built. One of the key elements of that rail network was the Victoria Falls Bridge, which was an amazing engineering feat in those days. It was completed in 1905, and it basically opened up transport across the Zambezi River. The Zambezi River, if you can see it running over here, and of course the Victoria Falls, opened up northern Rhodesia to commercial development. And this bridge still functions. I was there a year ago and drove across the bridge into Livingstone, and it's an amazing site, but also the fact that it's still operating for both rail and for transport of cars and trucks. So let's now talk about sort of the beginnings of the actual Jewish communities in Zimbabwe and that's in Rhodesia. So we have this article printed in the Rhodesia Herald in 1895. They call it the Jewish Church. And it's the first service at the Masonic Hotel in Harare, what was Salisbury. I jumped between between Harare and Salisbury because the Salisbury was the original name. And of course, between Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, Rhodesia was the original name. And these are some of the names of the people who were at that service. You can see here Hyman, Morris, Harris, Friedman, Edwards, Pollack, Phillips, names that perhaps some of you will know. And that was published in 1895. In Bulawayo, the foundations of the synagogue were put up in 1897. But in fact, the shul, the actual synagogue, started in a tent. Even earlier than that. They already had started actually building a proper synagogue in 1897. In terms of early Jewish-owned businesses, just a couple of examples. This is the Commercial Hotel in Salisbury in 1905, owned by one Jacob Goldberg. And you can see the horse and carts was still, obviously the still main form of transport. And Jews were getting involved in running some of these small towns, or not such small towns. They were Michael Walensky. He was the first president of what was Gwelo, now Gweru, in 1897. I'll talk about Michael shortly. Joe van Praag was one of the first Jewish mayors of Salisbury in 1900. So you can see that Jews were very much involved in community affairs, wider, municipal management of these towns. And in Bulawayo, the first Jewish mayor was Isaac Qesher in 1897. So really, Jews were involved in the early days of organizing and building the country. What we're talking about basically is politically is a white minority rule of the Rhodesias. I'm talking about northern and southern Rhodesia. There was already resistance to the colonial settlement when Lobengula discovered that he had been kind of ripped off with the Rudd concession. There were already the first rebellions of blacks against the white colonialists. They were suppressed. And over the years, blacks were limited to urban locations or tribal trust lands, as they became known. They had severe limited property rights and no voting rights, of course. Land was given out to whites with huge areas of tracts of land were available and given to the early pioneers or bought very cheaply. And they benefited from having very cheap black labor. And of course, there's a similar situation in the mining and growing industrial base of Rhodesia's. There was a moderate and consistent investment in black education and healthcare in Rhodesia. And in fact, that tradition, I think, remains even today, that Zimbabweans are considered some of the best educated people of Africa and are in demand around the world for all kinds of professions and jobs. And I'll talk about what's happening with Zimbabwe today coming a bit further down the line. The real black militants started in the early 1960s, and again, I'll talk about the result of that shortly. So we have now the first Hebrew school in Bulawayo in 1901, a very small crowd of kids, but that's, and I can tell you, I've just got to look at my notes, forgive me. There's a story of the first white baby in Bulawayo. I'll just find that for you. Where is that now? Sorry. I can't find it in my notes. Oh, yeah, here we are. The Matabele Times announced that the prospectors for miles around came specially to bestow congratulations upon Mr. and Mrs. Moses Tempowski. It must have been about this time that a certain Scotsman strolled into a butcher's shop and exclaimed, "Man, do you ken what I saw on the road just now? A white woman carrying a wee baby in her arms." So this turns out to be the first. Her name was Lily Tempowski, and she was reportedly the first white baby to be born, a Jewish girl, baby, born in Bulawayo in April 1894. And of course, she may be in this picture here, I don't know. A new synagogue proper synagogue was built in Salisbury in 1918. This is actually where I had my bar mitzvah. A lot of my family had their simchot here. And this was on a street called Salisbury Street in Salisbury. In the 1920s and 30s, well, let's talk about 1923. Rhodesia became a self-governing colony. Up until then, it had been basically run by the British South Africa Company. So a corporate called the British South Africa Company had been running the country up until 1923, and then it became a British self-governing colony with a governor, a British governor, but it had quite a degree of independent governing. The Jewish population we're talking about in that period was around 1,400. And in the 30s, the Jewish immigration started to rise. This was obviously on the back of what's happening in Europe. And I'm going to talk specifically about what happened in northern Rhodesia in a separate slide. Interesting story. But people were trying to get out of Europe, and what was happening in South Africa was that they actually introduced quota acts for Jews. Just like many other countries, they were preventing Jewish immigration or what they called refugees or aliens, what they used to have a term for them, they called them aliens, preventing them from coming into South Africa, but they were allowing some of them to pass through South Africa and go and reach Rhodesia and northern Rhodesia. Most of the immigrants were from UK, Germany, Eastern Europe, and of course the story of the Jews from Rhodes I'll talk about separately. But a very interesting element in the dynamic of the Jewish community in Rhodesia. So these Rhodes Island Jews, or Rhodeslis, had sought safety and economic opportunities. Some of them went to the Belgian Congo, but some came directly to Rhodesia, as I mentioned, via Beira. I don't know if it's coincidental that they chose Rhodesia by the similarity in name to Rhodes, but a safari community developed in Harare, and I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that shortly. Just briefly about the world wars. Jews participated in the Second World War. Certainly, 65% of eligible Jewish men served in the Second World War. 26 of them fell in service. 6 fell in World War I, and we have records of in 1896 of one falling during the what I call the Native Rebellion that I mentioned earlier. In the Boer War, there was one killed, and 2 in 1893. In the Native Rebellion, there were 2 rebellions in Matabeleland. So Jews were very much involved in serving in the armed forces. They were obviously, Rhodesia was a member of the Commonwealth, and they sent forces. They sent soldiers to fight. My own father fought in the Western Desert and was based in Cairo, and served there for 4 years during the Second World War. These are interesting visits in the early days. In 1930, on the left-hand side, a visit by Chaim Weizmann, who was then working on behalf of Qesher Yesod, raising money for what was going to be the foundation of Israel, that was then Palestine, but he was raising money on behalf of Qesher Yesod. And on the right-hand side, we see a picture of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret behind, being accompanied by Benny Goldberg. Benny Goldberg was a very successful member of the Goldberg family in the Eastern Highlands of Rhodesia. Very successful farmers. There were 7 siblings. Interesting story of their family. But he went on to serve as a minister in what was called the Edgar Whitehead government before the Federation. I'll talk about the Federation shortly. So we can see that Jewish members of the community were already involved in the political structure of the country. In terms of businesses, community was prospering in the 30s, 40s, 50s. We have a business here, the Crown Clothing, owned by the Aladir family. The Windsor Hotel, owned by the Ruder family. Many businesses. I won't obviously be able to cover. These are just a couple of examples. If you want to look at my website, you'll find a lot more. But certainly, both in Harare, in Salisbury, and in Bulawayo, communities flourished. There was even a Yiddish theater in Bulawayo in the 1940s. We can see people on the stage here. We see a Shavuot gathering in the Jewish Guild Hall in Bulawayo in 1948. The community, you can see, is quite substantial. And then moving on to the 50s and 60s, we can say that there was a post-war prosperity and an organic growth of both communities. There was some immigration from South Africa as people sought perhaps more moderate political atmosphere. You remember that in 1948 or in the early 50s, South Africa had moved to being much more of an apartheid regime, and I think people were looking for more moderate type of atmosphere, and I think they found that in Rhodesia. We have the growth of Zionist organizations, There was an organization called Qesher, the Central African Zionist Organization, was very active in Rhodesia in those days. We have Witso. We have youth movements of Abonim, Beitar, and Bnei Akiva. I mentioned earlier, I was in Abonim. But the community was very, very organized and developing substantial institutions for the community. We have individuals like Abe Abramson, who became a Minister of Labor, Housing and Social Welfare under that Edgar Whitehead government. That's in the basically the early 60s. I think Martin is on the screen, his son Martin is on the Zoom this evening, and welcome, Martin. In 1953, so sorry, I believe that the Edgar Whitehead government would have been earlier than 60s. I'm sorry. Between 1953 and 1963, a federation was formed. This was basically an initiative of Britain to set up this federation between Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. One of the important aspects in terms of my talk this evening is that the main for 7 years of that 10 years, the prime minister of that federation was Soroy Walensky. He had a Jewish father and an Afrikaans mother who had converted to Judaism. He was not involved so much in the Jewish community, but he certainly eventually was buried in a Jewish cemetery. Benny Goldberg, I mentioned earlier, was a Minister of Agriculture, and they had built this very successful farming enterprise. And we can see on the right here a picture of Abe Abramson talking to there was a strike in 1960. He was talking to them as the Minister of Labor. In this picture on the left is Soroy Walensky with, at the time, Benny Goldberg was secretary to the cabinet. So just some other key Jewish individuals, and please forgive me, I'm not going to be able to mention all names. I know that I'm going to rub some people up the wrong way probably, but these are some names that I want to mention, and on my website I have a lot more profiles of people. There was the Barron family in Bulawayo, the lawyers and community leaders, the Sosky brothers, businessmen and community leaders, Harris family. B.S. Leon was a successful businessman and became a philanthropist. Nati Grill, A.I. Manashi. These are names of members of senior members of the community. Sam Levy, who went on to become a huge property developer in what is today Zimbabwe. Jack Pelham, Harry Cantor, the lawyer. Aya Rosen and his wife Muriel. Muriel became a member of parliament. So these are some of the names of key individuals in Southern Rhodesia who were in various industries and various professions. We have also the Honorable Justice B. Golden, who became I'm not sure if he was president of the High Court, but he was certainly a member of the High Court of Rhodesia. Bill Margolis became chairman of the Agricultural Marketing Authority. Again, a very successful industrialist, and involved also in community and in running the Agricultural Marketing Authority. Other individuals of prominence, Professor Michael Gelfand on the left here. Michael Gelfand had studied medicine in Cape Town, and he became a worldwide expert on African medicine. He became the professor and I think the dean or the professor or head of the medical school of the University of Rhodesia in Salisbury. Highly respected and very knowledgeable person. He was one of the few just to give you an idea, he was one of the few Jews who was given a state funeral by Robert Mugabe, the president of that became Zimbabwe, in recognition of his work. On the right of Michael Gelfand is the two Goldberg brothers, two other Goldberg brothers, Morris and Jaime, who were basically the tobacco farmers, very successful. On the bottom here on the right, Mayor of Bulawayo, Ralph Harris, and on the right of him is Harry Margolis, who was also involved in helping to develop the country. He is seen here opening a bridge that he had helped to finance. The federation that was formed between those three countries failed in 1963. There were pressures from black independence lobbyists. Northern Rhodesia became independent in 1964 and became the Republic of Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda. And it had caused many of the whites and Jews to leave Zambia. Nyasaland also gained independence in 1964 and became the Republic of Malawi. It did not have a Jewish community. Southern Rhodesia then became Rhodesia. And in 1965, under a white minority government run by Ian Smith, declared what was known as UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, from Britain, that basically said that the whites would remain as a minority, in minority control of the country, and they would basically reject any idea of majority rule of the blacks in Rhodesia. As a result of the UDI, UN economic sanctions were imposed on Rhodesia, and the instability and the economic challenges did cause some whites and Jews to start leaving. But in fact, the economic sanctions actually, in a way, in a big way, helped to improve the economy in Rhodesia, which had to become very much self-sustaining. And a lot of businesses actually flourished during that period. But along with those economic sanctions was the rise of militant blacks who were operating a guerrilla war from both Zambia and from Mozambique on the eastern border with Rhodesia. And that war lasted just over 10 years, and basically the minority white capitulated and agreed to a majority rule by the blacks, and by 1980 the country became independent and became known as Zimbabwe. So during that period, again, another wave of Jews had started to leave. My own parents left in 1978. They basically did not imagine there would be a good future for the country under black majority rule. Just to give you a little bit of background, for those of you who don't know the story, where does the name Zimbabwe come from? So Great Zimbabwe is a fascinating archaeological site in east of Zimbabwe, in an area which used to be called Fort Victoria. It's now called Mashvingo, but it has been researched by archaeologists, and they believe that this was a capital of people who lived in this area going back to the 4th century AD. The bulk of the buildings that you see here in these pictures were built in the 13th century. The archaeologists believe that they were built by the ancestors of the Shona people. The Shona people are the tribe that live in this area and in the northern part of Zimbabwe. And it's a very, very impressive site. I don't believe there's a site like this south of the pyramids of Egypt. It spans a huge area, and these walls that you see in the picture here are really, really impressive. They're several meters thick. It's all dry stone. And I've read a couple of books on the theories of this, of who built it and who could have been involved. There was clearly trade with perhaps people coming from the east, perhaps coming from Arab countries, coming down the east coast of Africa and looking for gold and perhaps setting up these kind of city states. But it's believed that some 18,000 people lived in the city at one point. So that's the story of how Zimbabwe gets its name. And the Zimbabwe bird, which is this picture here in the middle, was one of the few items that were found at the site and became the symbol. If you look here on the left, on the top left-hand corner of my slide, the Zimbabwe bird became the image and the emblem for the country. So this is how Zimbabwe looks today. If you just to get an idea, it's some people call it the teapot country. It looks a bit like a teapot. In the top left-hand corner here, we have Victoria Falls. On the Zambian side is Livingstone. We have Bulawayo down here. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why it jumps like this. I'm sorry. We have Bulawayo, which was, as I said, a large railway junction, but it also developed a very big industrial base and a community in its peak of probably around 2,000 to 3,000 Jews. And those two lines that are shown here on the map are basically lines of what are called the Midlands. This was a sort of a ridge of land between Bulawayo and Harare, Bulawayo and Salisbury, where there were several towns along the railway. The railway ran, as you can see, through Gweru, or Gwelo, and then Kwekwe, Gatuma, and arrived at Harare. And each of these small towns, Kwekwe and Gweru, particularly Kwekwe and Gatuma, or Gatuma as it was known, they were mining towns, and small Jewish communities developed around these towns. And I'll show you pictures shortly of their activities. The Midlands of Zimbabwe, as I mentioned, one town was called Gatuma, now called Kadoma. This is a synagogue. It was built in 1953. And on the left, at the bottom here, we see Rabbi Komisar, Yosowski, and Papo with community leaders of Gatuma at the opening of the synagogue. This is a reconsecration of the Kwekwe cemetery in 2004, just 20 years ago, with Rabbi Silberhaft, who is currently the spiritual leader of the remaining community in Zimbabwe, with other members of the community. And I can tell you that the communities that are left there are doing an amazing job in maintaining the cemeteries and the synagogues. Well, this one in Gatuma, there's no longer a community there. It was sold, but certainly the synagogues in Harare are well maintained. Unfortunately, the synagogue in Bulawayo burnt down in 2003, but there are still some activities around the Jewish center that they have. So this is a picture of, I mentioned WITSA earlier. This is a WITSA conference in the 1960s. There were conferences, regular conferences of the Jewish community, all the different organizations. This is the Rhodesian Zionist Youth Conference, members of the youth movements. And this picture is a bit earlier in the 1950s. I'm not exactly sure the date. of Habonim, the Habonim youth movement. You can see the number of kids in the movement at the time, very active. Just about every Jewish kid was connected to one of the youth movements. There was a high degree of connection to most of the Jewish activities, and a very Zionistic community. I would not call the community a very religious community. It was kind of quite secular, but certainly very Zionistic and very involved in Zionistic activities. This is an interesting also development of sports clubs. This was the Wingate Park Club. I visited a number of years ago. Jews were, let's say, not welcome at certain sports clubs. Sport was a very big activity in Rhodesia, and certain clubs did not accept Jewish membership. There wasn't a high degree of anti-Semitism in Rhodesia, but there was this kind of low-level pushback against Jews in certain areas, including, as I say, sports. So the Jews in Harare, in Salisbury, got together and built quite a successful sports center, which had a bowling section and tennis section, a golf section. And the golf section still remains. This is the golf section, which is still maintained. And in Bulawayo, sorry, I'll talk about Bulawayo shortly. This was also a development in Harare in the 60s and 70s. Large community hall which could seat over 800 people. Quite a modern place, and alongside it, across the plaza from the hall this was called the Harry Margolis Hall, and on the right here we see a modern synagogue replacing the original one which I'd shown you earlier. So this became part of the new sort of community center in Harare. The hall subsequently, in the last, I'd say, 15 years, has been sold. It's no longer belongs to the community. The synagogue still does belong to the community, but the numbers are very small, and I'll talk about that also shortly. Just to give you an idea of life in Salisbury, Harare in the 1960s, very clean, wide streets. Many Jewish-owned businesses were flourishing in that city. My own father had a furniture company, but there were many owners of manufacturing businesses, pharmaceutical businesses. There were some Jewish farmers out in the countryside. There were professionals like doctors, dentists. Jewish community was involved in a wide range of activities, but it was a very livable city. But I'm saying that in terms of course, most of it being available to the white community. The black community lived in more squalid conditions. These are pictures of what they call the townships surrounding Harare. Townships such as Harare, Chitungwiza, and Imbari, and conditions not so good. These were was not such great infrastructure. A huge disparity in of course the earning power of the blacks compared to the whites. I'm just going to now talk a bit about I mentioned the Sephardi community, and just talk briefly about them. So they emanated from Rhodes Island in the Mediterranean. They had been in Rhodes for basically since the Spanish Inquisition, and had made their way. As many Jews had moved to Turkey, they also came to Rhodes. And Rhodes itself was governed by Italy at some stage. But in the 1930s, and of course in the Second World War, it was taken over by the Germans. And tragically, a large part of that community were taken to Auschwitz. I believe the figures around 1,200 of the remaining community were taken to Auschwitz and murdered at Auschwitz. But those that made it to Rhodesia in the 30s and prior to that built these beautiful shul and hall. And you can see on the right-hand side here at the bottom, the Rhodes Community Hall, which was like a place for meetings and for activities, for events. I think at its peak, the Sephardi community was around 1,500 in Salisbury, Harare. So just moving on to the 60s and 80s, at its peak, the Rhodesian community of Zimbabwe was around 7,500 Jews, but probably in the mid 60s. But that started to dwindle by the late 60s and early 70s. As I said, after UDI, and certainly after independence or around independence, there was a tremendous drop in numbers. So the building of the new Ashkenazi synagogue and community center, unfortunately, the timing was not great, because although the community was quite large at that point, it did start to dwindle very soon after the centers were completed. I mentioned the Black militant uprising that had started in the 60s, led by Robert Mugabe, those probably you know the name, and Joshua Nkomo, who was basically from the Ndebele tribe in the southern part of southeast part of southwest part of the country. So that became then that militant uprising really took a toll on the white community. They could not contain it, and there was a beginning of the sharp decline. Youth were leaving, many to Israel, to South Africa, and others such as Australia, Canada, USA, and the UK. In 1980, I mentioned earlier, Zimbabwe became independent under Robert Mugabe, and numbers had dropped in the community by probably around half, and started to dwindle even further after that. There's a story which is a little unknown, probably an unknown story by many around the world, that Robert Mugabe used one of his army units to attack civilians in the Matabele area of southern Zimbabwe. They were trained by North Koreans, and it's believed that some 20,000 civilians were murdered in that period. This was very much Mugabe and his party ensuring that they had control over the country and that would not be threatened by the Matabeles. But it's a big, long story, and I won't go into detail now. It's worth reading up about it. It's a very tragic story. Okay, so I want to mention now, and I mentioned the institutions in Harare. In Bulawayo, there were similar institutions. This is the picture of the synagogue, and also a beautiful synagogue in Bulawayo. Unfortunately, it did burn down. And this is the result of the fire. Similar to what happened in Harare, there was a Parkview sports club built in Bulawayo. Amongst its founders were Grossberg, and it was and also I think it was opened by Charles Whiteson. So again, Jews were involved in synagogue activities, in sport activities, and this is what Parkview looks like. The sort of entrance to Parkview looks like today, very run down. There are other Zimbabwe institutions that I want to mention. Kaza magazine, there was a very active sort of newspaper and magazine that was published every month. It ran between 1958 and 1970. I have copies of that on my website. There's some interesting stories in there. Prior to that, actually, in the 1920s, there was a newspaper brought out called the Jewish Guild. So Jews were already publishing stories and articles uh, even in the early 1920s. Jewish cemeteries. There are cemeteries, two main cemeteries in Harare, one main cemetery in Bulawayo, and in the Midlands there are small cemeteries, very well maintained, and really great work done by the small number of Jews that live there. The Savillon Lodge was built, I believe, in the early 60s. It was opened and served the community for nearly 30 years. As a retirement home, but is no longer active. There were no elderly people to service the lodge, and it has been closed down. In Harare, there was a Jewish primary school built in the same grounds as the synagogue. A very successful school. I believe it was the early 60s, the first classes were established. It's running still today as a Jewish school. But I don't know if there are any Jewish kids there. I don't think there are any. There may be one or two. But in Bulawayo, I don't believe there are any Jewish kids. This is the primary school in Bulawayo. Again, and I'm going to try and show you this video. I hope you can hear it and watch it. No, it's not running. I'm sorry. For some reason, it's not running. It's been blocked. But this is a picture from the back of the prize giving in April 2024 at the Carmel Jewish Primary School. And they're actually singing Hatikva. I don't think there's one Jewish kid in this hall, but they're mostly black kids with kippot on them, and they're singing Hatikva. And it is amazing that these schools, both Carmel in Bulawayo and Sharon School in Harare, are still maintaining Jewish traditions. Okay, let's move on. Just a picture of, I showed you Harare earlier. This is a picture of Bulawayo, wide streets, very clean city, beautiful gardens and fountains. I mentioned the cemeteries. These are the names of the cemeteries. You can see them on my website using this link. And today, there are less than 100 Jews in the country. Shul services are held in Bulawayo. And in Harare, between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi shuls, they do share the minyan. And they do keep, as best they can, they keep the services going. I'm not sure to 100% of the situation, as I said earlier, if there are any kids in the Jewish day schools, but the Jewish day schools are still run as Jewish day schools and are owned by the Jewish community. The spiritual leader of the community is Rabbi Moshe Silberhaft, who lives in Johannesburg, and he travels up to Rhodesia very often, to Zimbabwe very often. Okay, I'm going to move on to, I can see the time's moving. I'm going to move on to Northern Rhodesia. Just briefly about the history of that country. It was again also under the British South Africa Company until 1924. And in 1911 became Northern Rhodesia. Sorry, became Northern Rhodesia. So I guess that date is wrong. It should be 1924. And these copper and other deposits were found in the north of the country. A peak of the community in around the early 60s was about 1,200 in total, and living mainly in Livingston, Copperbelt areas, small towns in the Copperbelt and in Lusaka. And in 1964, the country became independent under Kenneth Kaunda becoming Zambia. These are some key Jewish individuals. This is Eli and his brother Sussman. I forget the brother's name. Eli and Harry Sussman, doing business in the early days in Zambia. They went on to be very successful businessmen in the whole of Rhodesia and in South Africa, in fact, with other individuals. Abe Galoon was a well-known farmer and industrialist, and involved also in community affairs very much. His son Michael carried on after him. I want to talk briefly about this story. This is, I mentioned earlier. It's not a well-known story, but in the 1930s, Northern Rhodesia was one of the few countries in the world that had no quota for Jewish immigrants. And this chap, Frank Shapiro, wrote a book called Haven in Africa. It's an interesting story, interesting book, where he researched documentation involving the British Board of Deputies in the UK, and why this information never got to the Jews of Europe, of Eastern Europe and of Germany and basically the whole of Europe, why they never got the information that they could get a visa to Northern Rhodesia. I won't go into the story now, but you can read about it on my website, and it makes a very interesting, a very sad, in fact, story as to, was this a huge missed opportunity to get many and save many Jews in the Second World War. Sorry, this is just briefly a map of the Northern Rhodesia and what became Zimbabwe. You can see Livingstone, Lusaka, and Copperbelt areas. The Copperbelt had these mineral resources, and these small towns like Mufulira, Kitwe, Chingola, Broken Hill, and Ndola developed, and they all had small Jewish communities. And there are Jewish cemeteries there today, some not so well kept because there are no Jews in the area. And there were synagogues established in Ndola and Kitwe. And you can read about that on my website, including I've got images of all the cemeteries, the gravestones at the cemeteries. So some of the names that are well known for the first founders of the Zambian Jewish community were the Wolfsons, the Grills, the Galoons. I mentioned Sussman. The first community actually started in Livingstone, and it was called the Gateway to the North. That's where they built that famous bridge. And these were immigrants mainly from Europe, Germany, and Russia. Around independence, many whites and most of the Jews left the country. These are well-known figures from Zambia. On the left, we have Stanley Fisher, who became the governor of the Bank of Israel, and also was a deputy head of the Fed in America, the Federal Reserve Bank in America, very successful economist. He was born in I think it was Mufulira, if I'm not mistaken, but he, at the age of 13, moved to Bulawayo and was educated at Milton High School in Bulawayo. He joined Habonim in Bulawayo and also went to Israel, and where he learned Hebrew in his probably in his after high school. And when he came back to become the governor of the Bank of Israel, his Hebrew was actually still quite good. Simon and Cynthia Zukas, interesting story behind them. Simon was born in Lithuania, It became a very active participant in the country's struggle for independence and later held many key political positions. And Simon was honored with a state funeral when he passed away at 96 in 2021. One of the interesting characters and interesting individuals in the Jewish community of Zimbabwe. He was also, of Zambia. He was also very involved in the Zambian Jewish community. So these are the cemeteries in Zambia, and you can find them on my website. These are images of the Zambian synagogues. They were very simple buildings. They were small communities. Some of them have become churches. This is the former Ndola synagogue. There's inside of the Lusaka. These are paintings done by a well-known architect, Jay Waronka, I met, who has done an amazing work in recording synagogues around Africa. There's just a handful of Jews left in the country in Zambia. The Zambian Jewish Council generously donated funds from the sale of their synagogues to the School of Medicine in Ndola and to the School of Medicine in Tel Aviv. They also helped to establish the Gateway Museum in Livingston. I was there a year ago, fascinating museum on the story of the Zambian Jewish community. You can find on my website a story of that. There is an ongoing project in support for the Ndola Medical School run by Aviva Ron, who lives in Israel, and she goes out to Ndola quite regularly to help with that program. Most of the cemeteries are generally maintained, a few of them are not. I believe there is a Chabad rabbi in Lusaka, but I have not had direct contact with him. I just want to talk briefly about the Lemba. It's an interesting story. There are some 50 to 60,000 Lemba in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, but many in Zimbabwe, who claim Jewish heritage and who have Jewish rituals. You can see them here with their talis and their wearing they do Shabbat and they do circumcisions and they are practicing Jewish rituals. They are not officially recognized, but there is a claim that they have a DNA connection to what's called a Cohen. Hang on, I'll tell you now. It's called the Cohen haplotype. It's a type of gene called which is connected to Cohenites, Levites, and Ashkenazites. So there is some theory that they have a DNA connection to the Jews, and it is believed, I went to a lecture that these Jews originated from the Yemen, and Yemenites came down from when they were trading, came down the east coast of Africa, and these are the descendants of these Jews. It's disputed, but that's the story. They are supported by an organization called Kulanu. Okay, I'm going to show you briefly, if I may. I'm just going to show you briefly a couple of online resources and also a few books if you're interested. This book, Majuta, written by Barry Cosman. I have scanned it. It's on my website. It's a very, very detailed story of the history of the Jewish community. Very, very detailed research by an academic. This book on the right was actually never formally published. It was written by Eric Rosenthal, and it was never formally published, but this is a fascinating book. I have it on the website. On the Zambian side, we have Zion in Africa, a detailed book on the story of the Zambian Jews, written by Hugh Macmillan and Frank Shapiro. There's another version here. I don't know why it's got a different cover. And I mentioned the book called Haven in Africa. It's a worthwhile read. It's an interesting read. And this book was a story of the trading empire of the Sussmans and the Wolfsons. Fascinating story of how they built up their businesses and their trading empire. I mentioned the Gateway Museum in Livingston, and I recommend you visit at least its website, which is here, but I also have on my website some background on it. Both countries are really beautiful. I can highly recommend visits, certainly to the Victoria Falls. And this is how they look today. Zimbabwe and Zambia, Northern Rhodesia. Just to give you, again, an idea of where they're located. They fit into Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, more or less fits into Texas, a bit less. Okay, so just to wrap up, the prospects for the communities, they've been dwindling for many, many years. The situation in Zimbabwe is not good economically. The small Jewish community that does remain there does do its best to maintain services. It's very challenging. Zambia also faces high inflation and extreme poverty. We're talking about GDP per capita of around $100 per head in both countries, roughly, in today's terms. So neither countries are really attractive places for Jewish communities. So in summary, they were extremely well-organized communities. They're mainly secular, as I mentioned, but strongly Zionistic, with a strong background of British colonial culture. There was the unique Sephardic community in Harare, with a very rich history. And the sharp decline became apparent in the 60s for Zambia and the 1980s for Zimbabwe. So today we have 100 Jews left in Zimbabwe and a handful in Zambia. We don't know about the future of the Lemba, but there are, all kinds of ideas or thoughts about whether they'll ever be recognized fully in the Jewish world. So I do preserve the story, and it is on my website. Here you can see the address and my email. And I thank you for your attention. I'm just gonna briefly, if I may, just show you if I can bring up my website. Oops, sorry. Okay, so this is the website. The shuls, the cemeteries. This is all the stories on Zambia. These are stories of families, the history. The books that I'd scanned are on here. Lots of different video interviews and archive photographs. That's on that website. I have something like 80 video clips on a YouTube channel, which you can find on my website, with a lot of different, you can see here, I'm just going to scroll down, a lot of also interviews and stories of the community. On Facebook, I have a group of nearly 3,000 members, and it's very active. People are posting every day items of interest, and it's like this virtual connection for the community around the world. So, sorry I went on a bit longer than I planned, but I hope you found it interesting. And Dora, over to you for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you for this amazing presentation. And thank you, of course, everyone for being here. I'm going to read now questions from the chat. And before I do, I just want to let you all know that with your contributions to Qesher, you're also donating to TELFED, which is an organization assisting the Southern African new immigrants in Israel. So thank you very much also for that. And now I will read the questions that come in. And also I want to thank everyone who was commenting on the chat. And I see that a lot of people are very connected and maybe even know each other or know Dave. And thank you so much for being here. There was a question about the Lemba. How have they been accepted into the Jewish white community?
Yeah, so I would say they have not been accepted, basically. First of all, on an official level, the rabbinate has not accepted them as full-blown Jews. The Zimbabwe Jewish community comes under the rabbinate of South Africa, and they have not. Although there's been, I know that Moshe Silberhoff, the rabbi, has been in touch with the Lembas. There have been no real efforts or movement on integrating them or accepting them. And to the best of my knowledge, they have set up their own, I know for a fact, they have set up their own synagogue in Harare. So in fact, there are 3 synagogues in Harare. The Lemba have their own, and they pray in their own synagogue. It's a house that was bought in Harare.
Thank you. I want to just mention all these comments that are thanking you, Dave, not just for the talk, but also for all the work that you do for the communities and for preserving this heritage. So there you can read later in the chat. Everyone is sharing about this, and I also want to say that we will send out an email tomorrow where you will receive the recording of this talk, which will be available for 3 days. So if you missed part of it, you will have the chance to rewatch, or you can rewatch it if you want to learn a bit more and a bit more detail. You will also receive the website of Dave and also further resources that he mentioned. We will send them all in an email so you will be able to research further. So I'll go back to the questions. Was there apartheid in Rhodesia? It seems blacks couldn't vote in elections and didn't go to school with whites.
So it was not called apartheid, but it basically was apartheid. I mean, it was not as I would say as institutionalized and legalized as it was in South Africa. But yes, there was a very, very defined role for the blacks or lack of role for the blacks in the Rhodesias. They could not vote. They could not own property. I mentioned earlier. They were allocated certain areas that they could live in. They would then come into the white areas to work. They could not live in white areas. They could not buy property in white areas. They could not. But let me give you an example of things that they could do. For example, I went to the University of Rhodesia, which was a multiracial university, which that did not exist in South Africa. So there were elements of life in Rhodesia that were, I would say, more moderate and more liberal, if you want to call it that. Maybe liberal is a bit far-fetched, but certainly not as strict and not as entrenched as it was in South Africa.
Thank you. There's a question about a little bit about the situation today. Why is the economy so bad? Is there a lot of crime? Is there any anti-Semitism? If you can speak about this.
So basically, it's a lot about there's a huge amount of corruption in Zimbabwe. Mugabe was president for I think it was close to, if I'm not mistaken, he became president in 1980 and was president for over 35 years. He kept the power to himself and his cohorts, and they basically sucked the country for what they could. And I mean, Zimbabwe, ironically, they found huge diamond reserves or diamond deposits in the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe in the last 20, 30 years that could have turned the country's economy around. But all of that wealth was sucked out of the country and is probably sitting in Swiss bank accounts or wherever, and certainly did not benefit the people of Zimbabwe. The management of the country also, in terms of institutions, in terms of government management, was very poor. This all started around the 2000s, I guess, was about the main, I would say, milestone when Mugabe started confiscating large white farms and handing them out to his friends or to what they call former veterans of the Zimbabwe. The militants who had been fighting the whites basically were given farms taken from the whites to people who had no idea how to run big commercial farms, and the economy went into a complete spiral from that point on. So that helped, or it contributed greatly to the downfall of the economy in Zimbabwe. inflation became in thousands of percent. They eventually had to give up on the Zimbabwe dollar, and they had to, all transactions had to be done in US dollars. So they really the country had come to basically to its knees.
Thank you. I see Robert's hands up, so please go ahead.
Dave, thanks for a very concise and well presented history. If I just try and convey to those on the meeting who didn't grow up there, that, you know, growing up in Bulawayo, Jews ruled. You know, we grew up in a ghetto, a Jewish ghetto, Kamala, but it was a wealthy ghetto, and the Jews were prominent in every center and circle of life, whether it was the mayor or in politics or in industry or in commerce, and our lives revolved around Judaism, around Habonim or Beitar or the synagogue. Our weekends and our social lives were taken up with Jewish activities, Onig Shabbatot, or Habonim camps, or socials at the Jewish Guild Hall. And everything we did revolved around our Jewish beings. And it was something completely natural. We never questioned, you know, I didn't even know I was Jewish till I was 6 or 7. It was completely taken for granted. And somebody at school, when I first went to junior school, I must have been 6, asked me if I was Jewish or Christian. And I didn't know. I had to go home and ask my mom. And being Jewish was just part of how we grew up in Bulawayo particularly, and Salisbury to some extent as well, but Salisbury was more disparate, it was more split up. But Bulawayo was a cohesive Jewish community involved in the arts and in theatre and in culture, in sport, in every aspect. The Jews dominated in Bulawayo, and it was a wonderful place and a wonderful way to grow up. And it was just something I wanted to put across, because it's very difficult to understand and appreciate it if you weren't there.
Absolutely agree. Harare, Salisbury was a little different. We had the two communities, but I was every weekend I was at Habonim, or I was at shul, or at camps in the summer holidays. Absolutely involved in our little Jewish worlds. We were a Jewish bubble in a white bubble, so small. We were a Jewish bubble inside a larger white bubble inside the larger bubble of the whole country. But we lived in a bubble.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this, Robert. There was a question if there is any anti-Semitism, were there any uprisings, any Jews harmed or any synagogues harmed?
So I've read, if anybody wants to read the book by Barry Cosman, it's on my website, which I know Barry well, and he gave me permission to scan it. He did a tremendous amount of research on this issue of anti-Semitism, and he scanned newspapers very, very thoroughly, and he wrote a very, very thorough book. It was his thesis for his PhD, and he did find elements of anti-Semitism in Rhodesia, but I would say it was not. I certainly grew up. I never felt it in a kind of obtuse way. I never experienced it myself personally. I mentioned earlier why the Jews created their own sports clubs, and that was because Jews were not allowed. I remember someone telling me that there was a sign outside a club in Harare that said "No Jews and no dogs." Okay, and that was apparently quite an extreme expression of that pushback against Jews or anti-Semitism. But Jews were active, as Rob said. Jews were active in all levels of the community, in all levels of the society, and and I think, look, there were articles in the newspapers that Barry Cosman refers to in the 1930s, pushing back against Jewish immigration. These were Jews that were trying to get out of Europe, and were supposedly threatening jobs for the whites in Rhodesia. And I think that also resulted in some expressions of what we could call anti-Semitism.
And do you know anything about today?
I'm not aware of any, I've not had any reports of any anti-Semitism. You know, there's just so few Jews left there. They live okay. I was there a year ago. I was there a few years ago. And had no one tell me that they experienced anything of any anti-Semitic nature.
Thank you. I see someone mentioning books of Peter Godwin and When Crocodile Eats the Sun and the fear about Mugabe's terror regime and that his father was Jewish. If you want to comment or say anything about this.
Sure, it's an interesting story. Peter Godwin, in one of his books, I think it was A Crocodile Eats the Sun, or maybe it was The Fear. He actually writes about how his father was Jewish, and he had not shared that with his own children until on his deathbed. And Peter, I've been in touch with Peter. He has made some interesting comments about how I remember one of his famous quotes was that the whites in Africa were like the Jews in Europe. They were the sort of I have to remember I don't want to make a mistake on the quote, but he basically compared the situation of the whites not being accepted in Africa as the Jews had not been accepted in Europe during the Second World War. But specifically about Peter Godwin's work, he does write about the terror regime that Mugabe implemented and made it very difficult for anyone to challenge his presidency.
Thank you. Were there any kosher markets? And if yes, do they exist still today?
Kosher what?
Kosher markets, kosher shops.
When I grew up in Salisbury, there was one kosher butchery. You could buy for Pesach. They would bring in Pesach kosher for Pesach stuff into the supermarkets. I can't remember there being specific kosher supermarkets, but you could get goods that were imported from South Africa. And in Bulawayo, I believe the same. I believe a similar situation. There were probably a couple of kosher butcheries. Maybe people from Bulawayo can comment. I don't know.
Yeah, I actually just see a comment that someone wrote that there were kosher butchers in both Harare and Bulawayo at least into the 1980s.
Yeah, correct. But today every Pesach they bring a truck from South Africa to both Bulawayo and Harare with kosher Pesach goods. That's the only way they can get that.
Thank you. Given the current atmosphere in South Africa, where the ANC is extremely pro-Palestinian, has any of this come over the border into Zimbabwe?
Look, I can tell you from the period that I was there in the early 90s. In the early 90s, there was a Palestinian ambassador in Zimbabwe, Ali Alame. And around the time of the Oslo Accords, when there was a signature, I remember being at an event with Ali Alame and Alon Liel, the South African Israeli ambassador, or the Israeli ambassador to South Africa, who came up to Zimbabwe, and we got together and there was an event to celebrate the signing of the Oslo Accords. The Palestinians had very close relations with the Zimbabwe leadership. They considered themselves to be comrades. They had all been probably trained in Russia together, and they felt an affinity to each other. That the kind of narrative that that Israel is a colonial power it's kind of resonated with them in Zimbabwe as well. Today, I believe in Zimbabwe, it's not an issue. It's not such an issue. the Muslim community in Zimbabwe is much, much smaller than it is in South Africa. I think what we're seeing in South Africa today is much more an expression of the size of the Muslim community there compared to the one in Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much. I hope I managed to read all of the questions, or most of the questions at least. We are now quite over time, so we will, and I know that many of you are in Israel, so especially Dave. So we're going to close now and wish everybody a very good night. But I want to really again thank you, Dave, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you everybody so much for being here, for being active, asking, commenting. It was lovely to have you all here with us. And as I mentioned earlier, tomorrow we will send out follow-up resources, so you will have the chance to learn more, mostly through Dave's website, and also the other resources that he mentioned we will include in tomorrow's email. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Dave.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thanks very much.
everyone. And we wish you a wonderful rest of the day, or good night if you are already in this part of the world.